Associate Professor at the University of Queensland and Director of UQ Risk, a leading-edge, multidisciplinary initiative that crosses the fields of industrial risk and human factors. Maureen works collaboratively with a broad range of safety-critical industries to develop better human-centered risk management approaches that improve companies' operational performance and competitiveness. Her industry-focused research is motivated by 18 years of industry experience, working in a number of different countries and in a variety of roles, including specialist engineering, line management, organizational change, and business performance improvement roles. Maureen also develops and delivers risk management and human factors training, education and advice to undergraduate and postgraduate students, and as well as directly to industry. She supervises Masters and PhD candidates undertaking industry-focused human factors and operational risk-related research. So please, I'm going to hand over to Maureen. Thank you, Maureen.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so today I'm going to give a presentation on managing major disruptive risks, which is a topic that's quite topical at the moment, excuse me, with COVID-19. So I'll start with the introduction. And in general, most entities, be it individuals, be it companies, be it states or nations, we aspire to preserve our existence by preventing adverse events happening, and we also aspire to continue to improve our performance so that we might capture opportunities and realise our potential. Given this context, risk is the uncertainty that matters because it can affect our ability to achieve our objectives by either exposing us to disasters and adverse events, or by ensuring or by helping us miss out on opportunities that might realise our potential. Given that definition, in the major disruptive risk space, major disruptive risks are the often rare but widespread, significant and have long-lasting impacts. And as I mentioned earlier, the classic example at the moment is COVID-19, which is affecting a large number of entities, both individuals, organisations, states, countries, as well as globally. Its impact is of a long-lasting duration. So we have the impact of the virus, and then we'll have the ongoing impact of the economic and international supply chains, which will last for some period of time, as well as travel and tourism. So COVID-19 has impacted many people, many entities, and the impact will be long-lasting. The impact has also been quite severe in terms of our ability to achieve our objectives. It has changed what we do. It has had significant downside impacts on many, but there's also a number who have experienced significant upside impacts associated with the virus, because the opportunity to address this pandemic has created opportunities for a number, not only in the medical field and in the supply field, but also in other fields. Major disruptive risks can stem from, generally speaking, biological causes, environmental causes, and man-made causes. And I'll go through some examples of those. So biological disruptors are generally classed as human transmittable diseases, like the coronaviruses, HIV, AIDS, the flu, and there's a timeline of some of those, as well as the impact that they've had in terms of fatalities, shown on the chart. Animal-borne diseases, such as mad cow disease, and there's numerous mosquito-related diseases, including dengue fever, and vegetable-borne diseases, such as salmonella and legionnaires. Outbreaks of these types of biological disruptors can create major disruptive risks. In terms of environmental disruptors, we have earthquakes, and a recent example is the Christchurch earthquake. We have cyclones and hurricanes, such as Hurricane Katrina and Harvey, that impacted the United States, as well as we have cyclones here that have had significant impact over the years. Tsunami and floods, bushfires, droughts, solar storms, and climate change are examples of environmental disruptors. And shown on the slides are some data that shows, the top slide shows a count of natural disasters by cause, and you can see that has increased from 1980 to 2016. The graph underneath shows the overall economic losses associated with these disasters in US billions of dollars. And you can see in the recent decade that number has been higher than in the early 80s or even the 90s. Man-made disruptors fall into a number of categories, and some examples are the industrial disasters. In the oil and gas sector, that includes the Deepwater Horizon event, Texas City, the Buncefield fire, the Lac-Mégantic derailment. In the chemical industry, we've had Bhopal, Savesco, and West Texas. The nuclear industry, two examples are the Chernobyl disaster and the Fukushima disaster. In manufacturing, there has been a number of garment factory disasters, and there's been the Georgia sugar dust explosion, as well as a number of fireworks disasters. Mining, we've had the SOMO, which is an underground coal explosion. We've had a number of dam disasters, and the Brumanminho is one. And there has also been major mine collapses, including the Kawasi one. Supply chain disasters include the Port of Tianjin explosion and the West Texas explosion that happened in the US. There's been aviation disasters such as the Concorde crash and the space shuttle disasters. And more recently here, especially in Queensland, we've had the Dreamworld disaster, which I'll talk more again about later on. But that's just one of many amusement park disasters that have occurred around the world, and there's some examples there. When we look at these disasters, we see a similar trend to what we see in the natural disasters. We see that the costs are going up for individual events, and there doesn't seem to be any decrease in occurrence, and some may argue there's an increase in occurrence of these disasters. And the data there shows the major losses for the onshore oil and gas and petrochemical industries. That was done in 2015, and it shows the asset losses as well as the business loss and the net combined losses in that graph. Other man-made disruptors are political and economic influences, such as the GFC was the major disruptor. International embargoes and sanctions, and the graph there shows the dramatic and fast change that happened to world plastic waste recycling when China decided to ban the imports of such waste. There are trade wars, and there are also changes in taxation and regulations, and carbon tax is an example of that, that has disrupted the way we do normal business. There's also another example of man-made disruptors as security breaches and terrorism. These can be both in the cyber world or in the physical world, or they can be a combination of cyber-physical. So to summarise what we see in the major disruptive risk space, we see that they continue to occur and their frequency is increasing. The impact of these events is also increasing in two ways. One, they are more costly, and two, they're becoming more widespread. The impacts of them are becoming more widespread. And we're also seeing cumulative events. As they become more frequent, these events begin to overlap or occur in quick succession. And in Australia, we have experiencing the cumulative effect of significant bushfires follow closely behind with the COVID pandemic. And Australia is not alone in that. A number of areas in the world are having cumulative major disruptive events happening at the same time. When we look at how risks are, how these types of risks are assessed, I like the quote from Bent Flyberg. He says, a host of cognitive and other biases, including simple wishful thinking, trick us into seeing mild risks where risk is in fact wild. So we have a tendency to downgrade these risks, and the picture there shows of the Valley Dam and the risk assessment there, where it was given high risk but low potential damage, and that dam did fail, and it led to multiple fatalities and major issues with dams and the mining industry globally. There is evidence that we use in our risk processes. We use the likelihood or even try and re-rate risks to get a residual risk rating that leads us to believe that the risks are either lower than they actually are, or they're more well managed than we have evidence to back up. And when we go and look at the incidents or the accidents that occur around the world, the reality is that they're not low risk and or they're not well managed. Our goal with major disruptive risks is that we want no big mistakes, and we want no big lost opportunities, and we want no big surprises. So we want to understand what these risks are, and we want to be able to quantify or assess those risks and then determine how to manage them so we don't make big mistakes and we don't miss out on lost opportunities, and we don't have big surprises. And the way I think about this is in terms of the people that need to be involved in this process, the approaches that we need to use, and the focus of this work, the focuses that this work needs to have. So in terms of people, there's a lot of words on this slide, but I think these words are really important. They were raised in the Dreamworld Coroner's Report, and they're particularly important to me because they go to these low probability or high consequence events. And I've highlighted some of the words to just provide a summary of what the coroner says. So history demonstrates that low probability consequences often turn out to be the cause of major unexpected events. The hazards associated with these events would have been obvious to somebody suitably qualified. And the last comment is, it is unfathomable that this serious and important task fell to staff who did not have the requisite qualifications or skill sets to identify such hazards. So two questions that come out of here, and the most salient one is the coroner talks a lot about what is a suitably qualified and competent person to do this work. And when I look at not only this event, but some of the other events, the weak signals tend to be there, tend to be hidden in the detail, or tend to be raised but then downrated, as I said with the quote from Bent Flyberg. So we need to find people or we need to skill people with the competencies to be able to detect these risks as significant risks. And we need to have approaches that really highlight the potential consequences of these risks and don't automatically allow them to be downgraded without some due diligence work to be done. This is one of the research questions that my PhDs are looking into, because I think it's quite important. And I think the work that's required and the thinking that's required to identify these risks and assess these risks are quite nuanced. And I don't think it's the same thinking that is typically used when we develop our risk registers. We get in a room, we do brainstorming, and we come up with, you know, the risks that we can imagine at the time. I think there needs to be a little more a separation between the routine, regular risks that we see and these low probability, high consequence risks, the major disruptive risks. In terms of approaches that people can use, disruptive risk can be dealt with through risk management or crisis management approaches, and this should be a deliberate and considered choice. There is data out there that says that if we use the proactive risk management approach, we'll get better economic outcomes, and that's shown in the graph on the right, with the purple showing the more advanced risk maturity companies and the pink colour showing the less advanced, and the differences in the revenue and EBITDA. And there's also the quote that over the longer term, the only alternative to risk management is crisis management. And crisis management is much more expensive, time consuming and embarrassing. Yet when I look and discuss with people about what's happening in the COVID world, a lot of the risks associated with managing this pandemic has relied on what's called business continuity in a lot of companies, planning, which is more a crisis management type approach rather than a prospective risk management type approach. For routine risks where they're foreseeable and we assess them as significant, they're typically done by risk management approaches, especially in the industries that I work in. But these rare high consequence risks seem to fall through, or can fall through, gaps by the downgrading of those risks. And when they occur, like in pandemics or in major dam failures or major explosions, and it often is pushed to crisis management, but there's not necessarily an upfront deliberate choice about this particular class of risk or this particular unwanted event is going to be managed by one or the other. And I think that we should do that, and I'll talk to that in the next 2 slides. But the first thing we need to do is assess these risks. And on the left is the ISO 31000, which is the international standard for risk management. It's their process where you set the context, the criteria, and the scope. It's very important when we're talking about these risks as what we consider. Often risk can be internal and near or short-term focus, but I think for these rare and major disruptive risks, I think we need to set the scope as longer term, set it more widespreading. These risks, as I mentioned earlier through the examples, can come from external sources, they can come from internal sources, and they can emerge from a mix of both, as I'm sure people are finding out as they're seeking to manage COVID-19. So it's important to set the scope and determine the timeframes and determine what is going to be considered and included and what is going to be excluded in the analysis. And then we can do the risk assessment. The risk assessment is about identifying, analysing and evaluating the risks. And there's one of the things that is really important is that that's underpinned by good evidence-based research, because in a lot of the scenarios that we see in this major disruptive risk space, they're not new. They've happened before to someone, somewhere in the world. They're often reoccurring, but over longer time spans. So there is usually some information around that describes not only what these risks were, but what the weak signals of the risks were. And that should be used in the assessment of the risk. The exception is for the emergent risks or the new risks, which Industry 4.0 which is short for the Industrial Revolution 4, which is all around the digitisation and Internet of Things and automation or autonomy. Those new risks won't necessarily have good or a long history of evidence-based research. So with those new risks and with the combination of those new risks and existing risks, there should be a process where you're trying to foresight or do a futures exercise to project what the potential, plausible, possible, and even preposterous future might be when you considering these risks separately, as well as the potential combinations of these risks that might occur. And then you can, once you've identified what the risk might be, you can assess those risks and evaluate those risks against risk appetites of individuals or organisations, even countries. Once you've assessed those risks, you can then determine how you're going to treat them. And if it's material enough, you'll decide to treat. If it's not, then you'll accept the risk, and that should be no instead of Y on that slide. If you're going to treat the risk, then as I said, you've got two risk treatment options. One is to control the risk using proactive risk management approaches, or the other is to do a crisis management approach. There is also the potential to do some sort of hybrid approach, but that is shown as a box because it should be a deliberate and very considered process. So there's a choice about what will deliver the most optimum solution for an organisation in dealing with certain risks. What sort of preparedness do they need, or what sort of resources should they put into crisis management should the event occur? And if the consequences and costs are acceptable for crisis management, then you put it to crisis or management or business continuity. If it's more optimum to put it to risk control and management, then you put it through a risk control and management approach, which is in the risk treatment box. Or as I said, you might do a hybrid. But this is not a one-off decision in time. We live in a world that's rapidly changing, both in terms of people and in terms of market and political environments, in terms of technology. So this is, the ISO 31000 shows it more as a linear approach, but I see it more as a continuous loop that gets regularly reviewed and updated and monitored. So in terms of the role of Industry 4.0, this is a little analogy that I use to sort of lead into my vision of what Industry 4.0 could or should be. And the picture there shows of a Brisbane street directory. We used to navigate our way around cities using directories like this. They were very paper-based. If it was a country, they'd be usually single maps that would be unfolded to A1 size. But we've progressed from these paper-based static systems that were updated regularly, but individuals usually didn't update theirs too regularly, to these navigators that we have now that not only show us in real time and in a user-friendly way where we are, where we're going, and what lane we need to be in, but also what our speed is and what our estimated arrival time is. So it predicts when we're going to arrive, it predicts what pathway we should go on. But now these things are interconnected that they can actually tell us if the traffic is jammed up or if there's roadworks on a road. It can even divert us to routes with tolls or without tolls, routes with or without traffic jams, and it does it in real time. So it's smart, it's digital, it's smaller, you only need one of these and you can travel the world. It's very, very different, more informative than the old paper-based system. In the risk and business continuity space, I see there's still a lot of reliance on the paper-based systems. They might sit in computers, but they're still not very smart. They're more record-keeping processes. So if we can take our navigation systems for our transportation from paper to digital, and digital that has forecasting abilities and forecasting ability to forecast not only vulnerabilities or threats but also opportunities, why can't we take the Industry 4.0 technology and do the same with our risks, business continuity and incident report or research, risk and business continuity related research practices? When I think about Industry 4.0 tech, I'm thinking about AI, so artificial intelligence, digital twins, the Internet of Things, and the connectivity that occurs between the physical world and the cyber world, as well as the humans and the technology. I think, and I have another number of students working in this space and a postdoc, I think this Industry 4.0 technology provides us with a great opportunity to transpose our paper-based, really static in terms of time, systems into real-time integrated representations that can be live on our desktops or even on our phones, and give us a real view of risks and controls and vulnerabilities that we have now, but also be able to do forward prediction capabilities using the evidence-based research that can really help the decision makers because I see these as cognitive aids, so aids that will help decision makers, not aids that will make the decisions for us. But it will really help them not only deal with the current risks, but also help them identify future risks in terms of threats and opportunities and vulnerabilities. But with all things, there's a catch. So I see that Industry 4.0 bring both threats and opportunities. So as I said, I think the 4.0 tech can really help detect, assess, and provide meaningful and foresighting information back to the decision makers responsible for managing major disruptive risks. I see that it can also be a threat, because if we become very reliant on these systems, then the failure of Industry 4.0 tech might actually become a major disruptive risk of itself. But there's also risks associated with using the tech that come into the accuracy and the validity of the algorithms and the models that sit under the tech. The potential for that to be distorted by bias or become outdated with time. So the use of the tech could actually mislead rather than inform. So there's a lot of power and potential, and also a lot of research, I think, to be done to make sure that the Industry 4.0 tech helps us and not hinders us in the management of these major disruptive risks. I think we need to look at opportunities to identify these risks better, assess these risks better, and manage these risks better, because as I mentioned, they are costing us lots in terms of money, but also lots in terms of human well-being and human prosperity and even human lives. So to conclude, before we get into the questions, major disruptive risks are occurring. They will continue to occur with increasing frequency, with more severity and more severe and more widespread impacts, and cumulative events will not be uncommon, and in fact I think they'll be more common. So we as humans have a tendency to disregard or downplay these risks, and I don't think we should do that, and I think we should need to understand risks that need to be full and complete consequences associated with these risks. As we're seeing with COVID-19, there has been a lot of flow-on consequences and a lot of interconnections between consequences that we're still experiencing and learning about. So the management of these disruptive events or major disruptive events, I believe, should involve the right people, nuanced processes, and focuses to ensure that evidence-based decisions are made around the proactive risk versus the reactive crisis management of these types of events. And Industry 4.0 offers us both opportunities and threats to a major disruptive event management that we need to consider and work out how to optimize for ourselves or our organisations or even our country. And we can do that with further research and development. We also need to do further research and development to capture lessons learned. So as I said, with all my examples that I started the presentation with, there's lots of opportunities to capture lessons from previous major events. A significant number of them go to inquiries that produce a lot of information and a lot of learnings that can be captured and can be leveraged to help entities, but also to develop better or more improved risk management systems and crisis management systems that will enable us to be more effective in identifying and assessing and managing both current and emergent major disruptive risks. So that was my last sort of presentation slide. I will hand back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Maureen. And a big thank you to everyone for listening. We're going to have some time for questions now, and there's a couple of questions already in on the question and answer. If you want to ask a question, just remind you that at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A icon, and you can type in your question there. So Maureen, I'll just read out a couple of questions to you. So there's one from Clint, and it's asked, or commented that often these new technologies are balanced between the financial impact of transitioning and the risk impact. What methods can be used to weight a cost-benefit analysis that values risk and cost, especially during times of financial crisis?
I'm just looking to see if I can see that question, because that's quite a good question. It's quite involved.
So you can click on the Q&A button as well at the bottom.
Yeah. Yes. So let me do that. It's I see that you've used the word impact on transitioning, and I think that's an important word, because one of the issues with risk management is that we don't do it over the life cycle. So there is the whole life cycle of adopting new technologies or transitioning from one technology to another that's important. But you're right, there are a number of trade-offs that occur, not only in the financial impact, but also in terms of social impacts or the impacts on humans, as well as the other impacts on businesses. It just occurred to me that for some reason I missed the slide that showed all the impacts, and there has to be a trade-off, and that trade-off has to be something that is not done just by the technology, but it needs to be done by the organisation decision makers who, against their risk appetite. I'm just flicking back to see. I don't know why that got lost. Doesn't seem to be there. I'll put that in the pack before it's distributed, the different trade-offs that need to be considered. And that's as I said, one of the dangers of one of the threats with AI is that the algorithms in AI produce a biased result that don't reflect the risk appetite of the businesses and businesses decision makers. So it needs to reflect their appetite. It needs to consider the trade-offs. It needs to consider the weightings for the different objectives that matter. So I'm not sure whether that answered the question.
I think maybe we can move on to, there's another question about financial risks there, Maureen, and it's kind of interrelated. How can financial risk measures like value at risk and expected shortfall be adapted to measure risks in Industry 4.0?
The value at risk measure can be, I've used that quite a bit, and I find that it's easy to adapt to. I think it's a good measure, and I think it's easy to adapt to all sorts of risks. The metric that you use is something that needs to be explored. So coming back to the dollar metric can be a bit challenging if you're trying to measure some of the social impacts or safety impacts, or even in some cases environmental type impacts. So you have to look at the metric that's used, and again it has to reflect the scaling of that metric, has to reflect the company's appetite. So some people use risk type indices or indexes to calculate a value at risk.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about resilience engineering that's been posted there.
Yep.
How do you think resilience engineering is used on major disruptive risk management?
So resilience is really, resilience is a word that's used and defined differently by different people. In the resilience engineering space, it's used to describe the ability of an organisation to adapt its functioning before, during or after one of these major disruptive events. And there are processes that are required to do that, that involve the surveillance of, or horizon scanning, or futures exercises that I mentioned. It involves research and learning from past events that I mentioned. It involves the willingness and the ability to have contingencies in place as required, so people and organisations can adjust and adapt. One of the, I think, the keys about resilience engineering is knowing when you're flipping from a risk or more risk-based approach to a more resilient type approach. So knowing when you're still within the designed limitations of, or what is, when you're within the limitations of what an organisation's designed to do, or when you're flipping into a beyond design scenario where you're drawing on the resilience to address the situation. And I think that the key is detecting what you're doing, and then having the systems and people and resources in place to know whether you're following the risk management based approach through more stringent controls, or whether you're providing, seeking to apply the resilience based approach where you're adapting and to or dealing with what you're faced with, which is a bit beyond design situation.
Okay, maybe we'll move on to Navrajit Singh's question next, and then we'll come back to Chris's. Can risks lead to changes which bring innovation and increased productivity and profits in the long term?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even in the short term, I mean, if you've seen what happened with COVID, there's a lot of people that are capitalising on the opportunity to address the current crisis through developing vaccines or supplies or drug treatments. There are others that are working more peripheral to that and looking at developing systems that are more resilient to the transfer or the contagion, so help prevent the contagion of such viruses. there are a lot of software vendors and webinar type software providers that are certainly capitalizing on the opportunity that we're all online and communicating in a virtual world. So definitely I see risk as the uncertainty that can cause both upside and downside deviations from objectives, and at least at an enterprise level or even an operational level, you should be considering both.
Thank you. Now, Chris has asked a question about how you see these things filtering down to the day-to-day workers. For example, the Dreamworld event appears to be related to the workers on the day as well as the company's systems.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And a lot of the major disruptive risks actually are felt, or the risk receptors of those risks are the frontline workers. And the ability to manage those risks and mitigate the severity of those risks often fall to the frontline workers in real time. So I think it's a really important perspective. It's a perspective, as Chris is one of my PhD students, as he has found in his research, and a lot of my PhDs have found in their research, is that frontline perspective is missing in a lot of the literature and a lot of the guidance, and there is a gap between work as imagined, as Eric Holnagel would say, and work as done. So it's important to take the user-centered approach to actually get on the ground. And the coroner made some specific comments about, in the Dreamworld case, about if you're going to risk assess something, you do it on the ground, you do it with the people, and you do it seeing things operating. You don't do it in a room as a desktop exercise. You do it in the field with the people at the risk phase, and you try and do it in both normal and abnormal situations. So the full extent of the risks can be, there's a better chance of identifying the full extent of the risks and appreciating their consequences or potential consequences.
Now that leads into the next three questions, I think, that are also about this: the people, the workers, the everyday workers close to the risk, and then the leaders and how you get leaders to listen to. So the first question is about UQ research. Is UQ risk involved in any projects concerning research and development or commercialization of scalable wearable technology devices worn by individuals to measure, predict, and hence mitigate risky behaviours, such as in safety critical occupations and industries?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is it does. That wearable tech offers a lot of opportunity, and if used correctly, can be a very powerful enabler to a step change in hazard identification and control in the safety critical industries. But there's a but, as there always is. There's some issues with and potential threats that tech brings. So it's important that the opportunities and threats of that tech is well known. So if it is implemented, that it is implemented in a way to deliver an optimum outcome, and not in a way that the threats will override the opportunities. So happy to talk to people offline about, in more detail, about what we're doing there.
Thanks, and I'd add too that the there's other groups at UQ that are working on the materials, working on the electronics, working on the devices themselves that link into this as well. So there's a range of work across the engineering and IT faculty and other groups as well.
That's true, because one of the things we do with that research is not look at it in isolation of other technology, because there's the power of not only using wearable tech but also integrating it within the other technology advancements that may come.
Now, there's the two questions that are waiting around getting authorities and leaders to react or show leadership here. So the first one I'll go to is, if a pandemic was always expected, why and how can we get the relevant authorities to listen and act/prepare? It seems we have the knowledge, but there's an unwillingness to act based on money and an inability to demonstrate the fallout in advance.
Yeah, I agree. It's the money question is interesting, because I don't think we know, and this goes back to my point about we need to be deliberate whether we're going to push these things into proactive risk management space or reactive crisis management. And I think we need to produce the business case in monetary terms, because that's the terms that they understand. And we can also produce it in other terms. Certainly I read that there's an article out today about the analysis of the modelling of COVID, and that's expressed in economic terms and loss of life or impact on life terms. So I think we need to actually do this in a more considered business case manner than what we've previously done.
And the second question along these lines was, COVID-19 has different impact on different countries.
Yep.
How do you see the role leadership plays in such kind of public crisis?
It's really interesting, isn't it, that and hopefully there's been announced that there will be an international inquiry on this. I'm not sure how far it will go. There's a lot of press about the role of media. There's some research literature on the role of culture. There is some other indications about the biological differences of people across or their immunity more across different countries. So it will be interesting to see how that pans out. I think that we have still got a lot of ways to go with COVID, and to see COVID into the situation where we can say that it's managed and then to recover from. So I think it's a little bit early to draw conclusions. The struggle that I had with answering a question like that is actually getting to really good fact-based information. There's a lot of media articles out there that are that don't present good fact-based information and are more opinion-based. And when you go to the facts of, what is actually the evidence of the disease in particular countries, they advocate certain leaders, like our New Zealand Prime Minister gets a lot of favourable press in Australia and elsewhere. But when you go to the evidence of what's happening in the disease in that country versus other countries, it doesn't seem to support necessarily what the media says. So I'm yet to get into the full details of that. I'm still collecting reputable information, and hopefully I'll be able to have a better answer, or a more evidence-based answer sometime soon. But I tell you what, it's a trial getting good information at the moment.
Maybe that leads me into a closing question, because we're coming up to 11 a.m, Maureen. Now, we're talking about leaders and we're talking about managing risk and training people to measure risk. Do you want to make a comment perhaps on what has changed in the way we train our engineers at university in their degrees, and what you think needs to continue to change in the way we provide training at universities for our future leaders?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I see in this space when I look at and read the incidents and the inquiries, it often points back to less than adequate risk management done by people. When I go and do a survey of risk management training or master's level type qualifications or even undergraduate qualifications around the world, there is very little available that sits in this major hazard space for safety critical industries or major risk space. So we've embedded that into our undergraduate engineering degrees, our occupational health and safety science degree, and our master's level degree. And we've got quite a number of PhD research happening in that space. And the Minerals Institute, SMI, at UQ also offer some online and face-to-face outside of COVID restrictions training in risk management. So there are some available. It's not widespread. There's lots more available if you're in the financial risk or insurance-based risk. But in this operational risks associated with the high hazard industry, there hasn't been a lot available. There's not much available now, but we do believe that it is really important to set a really important competency of our engineers and our occupational health and science students. So we do invest over a number of courses over the third, fourth and fifth years in teaching them about risk and what it is, how to identify and assess it, and the importance of being proactive and linking it to concepts like resilience engineering and high reliability organisations. And we also spend some time talking about the past, present and future of risk in order for them to understand that this is an evolving space and it's an area that people need to maintain CPD or continuing professional development in.
Thank you, Maureen. Could you just switch to the next slide, please? The final slide as we close out.
Yes.
Thanks. So thanks, Maureen, and thank you to everyone who's been participating today. We hope you found this session interesting and have been able to take away some practical information. Thank you to all the people who posted questions. We hope we got round to most of them. If you've got further questions, please feel free to contact us. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is the second in a series that we're developing over the coming months, featuring leading researchers, industry and alumni, presented by our schools of chemical engineering, schools of civil engineering, information technology and electrical engineering, and the School of Mechanical and Mining Engineering. We'll aim to cover a range of interesting and informative topics in these seminars. You can keep up to date with the latest news and opportunities to connect via our social media pages that are shown here and the website seen on the slide. So thank you again to Maureen, and for everyone else who participated. Stay safe, and we look forward to hosting you again soon.